What are the environmental impacts of cell towers, wireless networks, and other non-ionizing electromagnetic fields? Thank you for joining our expert webinar today, featuring several experts in science, policy, and law. To start, we are going to hear from wildlife biologist Albert Manville. He is retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. B. Blake Levitt will follow. She is an award-winning medical science journalist and researcher. And both Albert Manville and B. Blake Levitt are co-authors to a landmark three-part review paper of over 1,200 studies entitled Effects of Non-Ionizing Electromagnetic Fields to Flora and Fauna, published in the journal Reviews on Environmental Health. The third author to that paper is Dr. Henry C. Lai, University of Washington professor emeritus and former Electromagnetic Biology Medicine editor-in-chief, who has published extensively in this field. Their presentations will be followed by Erica Rosenberg, retired FCC attorney, who will present on how the FCC has failed in regards to its obligations under the National Environmental Protection Act. Daniel Favre will present his published research on cell phones and honeybees. Dr. Cornelia Waldman-Selsum will present her study on the impact of cell antenna radio frequency radiation to trees. Dr. Deborah Davis will present on wireless impacts to plants, new research on 5G, and our case against the FCC, and I will present on policy issues and next steps. And we'll start with Albert Manville, again, a wildlife biologist retired for many years at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, now senior lecturer and adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coordinating this important effort. First, let me just, since I'm talking about birds and bats this afternoon, let me talk about why birds are important. Well, they're insect controllers. They eat huge quantities of insect pests. Some suites of birds consume disease-carrying insects. Some are pollinators. Some scavenge seeds. They can cache seeds, which can be beneficial for other wildlife. We have nature's cleanup crew. Some of these scavengers, such as vultures, which are very important in removing carcasses, some of which are diseased. Rodent control is also important, and bird watching is a huge issue. Over 50 million Americans feed birds, 16 million or more travel to watch birds, and they spend $1.8 billion per year on equipment and about $4 billion per year on bird food, so incredibly important. Birds, however, are impacted by a whole host of issues. Natural mortality, and I'll just list it here and leave it at that. Much of the mortality is human-caused. Structures, collisions with TV towers, cell towers, power transmission distribution lines, building glass and lighting, etc. Huge issue. Electrocutions at distribution and transmission infrastructure, also a problem. Radiation impacts, our topic today. Entanglement and bycatch in fishing gear. So all these mortality issues are what we call cumulative. It's sort of analogous to death by 1,000 cuts. And sadly, birds are in serious trouble. Fully 1/3 of our 1,154 species of North American birds are in need of urgent conservation action. And electromagnetic frequencies are going to only add cumulative impacts to these already troubling circumstances. So bats. Bats are also critical ecosystem services providers. They control insect pests at huge ranges from 3.7 billion to 53 billion per year just in this country. They can eat their weight in insects per night. They remove disease-carrying insects, including those carrying malaria, dengue fever, West Nile virus, Zika, yellow fever, and many others. They're important pollinators. Think about your mangoes or your bananas or your guava or your agave, source of tequila. Bats are critical in pollinating these species. Some even disperse seeds. They're indicators of biodiversity and ecosystem health. And of course, from an ecotourism perspective, visiting the Congress Street Bridge in Austin, Texas to see the Mexican free-tailed bats or Bracken Cave is really important. So negative impacts on bats. Well, white nose syndrome is a huge killer. Since 2012, we estimate at least 6 million have died and many more since that time. They're carriers of a number of diseases, and some of these have been a result of clear cutting, climate change, the bushmeat trade, wet markets in Asia and Africa. Others are impacted, or other causes of mortality include pesticides, contaminants, and so on. Collisions with wind turbine, commercial wind turbine blades, 600,000 per year is the current estimate. Occasional collisions with communication towers. And the EMF effects on bats, which we're going to discuss this afternoon very briefly. Finding bat carcasses, however, is very difficult, and determining cause and effect is also a huge challenge. We have wildlife search dogs, thermal cameras, other technologies, but again, this can be somewhat limiting and challenging issues. So take-homes from our three-part paper, Blake and Dr. Henry Lai and I, 2021 Reviews in Environmental Health. We assessed over 1,200 peer-reviewed scientific papers in our three-part publication, including some of these which we had actually performed. There were two studies that really kind of got my undivided attention. First was a congressional briefing that I attended in 2000 by Dr. Ted Levitt, where he was detailing his study with DiCarlo and others, where they basically subjected chicken embryos to extremely low levels of radiation, 1/10,000th the radiation level from a standard 950 megahertz cell phone frequency on these embryos, and some of them died. The controls were unaffected. This seemed to represent a classic stress protein response to vanishing low levels of radiation. The second take home for me was working with Alphonse Balmari in his studies in Spain, where he had been following bird breeding, migration, habitat use in Spain for years. And then when cell towers came in, he was doing a follow-up study, and he documented nest and site abandonment, deviant nest building behaviors, significantly reduced recruitment, plumage deterioration, locomotion problems, and deaths in a number of bird species on his study site. So while these species had historically been roosting and nesting and breeding in his study area, he did not observe these symptoms until the construction of and operation of the cell towers. So I had the privilege of working with Dr. Balmari when I was with Fish and Wildlife Service. So given these findings from DiCarlo, Balmari, and many others, we need field studies, or at least a field study that would validate the impacts from communication tower radiation, that including direct and indirect, near field and far field exposures to birds, bats, and other wildlife. And this should include beneficial insects, reptiles, amphibians, and others. The study needs to be designed to standardize and tease out the impacting or independent variables such as the RFR frequencies, intensity, exposure, duration, and modulation, as well as documenting the dependent variables such as injuries, deaths, crippling losses, behavioral changes, breeding, survivorship, and reduced vigor. We need to do everything we can to try to avoid or minimize confounding variables such as lighting, guy wires, proximity to wetlands of towers that we would be studying. And the study must be conducted by credible independent scientists with no vested interest in the study outcome, and ideally with no ties with the communication industry. So we know that we can avoid or minimize impacts at communication towers by keeping them unguyed, unlit, and ideally monopole in construction. I co-authored the Fish and Wildlife Service's 2000 communication tower guidelines and then revised it in 2013. And since I retired, it's been revised again in 2018. But dealing with the radiation issue is more challenging because birds, bats, and insects often fly laterally to these transmission antennas. They are put at increased risk of impacts from the radiation. So some of the take-homes from our paper on birds, and there were many. We noted the injuries and deaths to a number of species here and others listed, noted oxidative stress in American kestrels from one study, disruption of birds' magnetic compass and magnetoreception issues, and the EMF impeding the bird's ability to sense the natural magnetic fields necessary for migration, orientation, and food finding. Negative impacts of birds' reproduction and physiology, as well as reduced reproductive success were noted. Bird attraction to cell towers resulting in possible collisions and additional EMF effects compounded the problems that we are trying to address here. Concerns over using radio frequency transmitters and marking tags, which can affect bird behavior and reduce bird fitness, including their mates, was a concern we raised in our paper. Additional concerns with tracking radars on birds and bats adversely affecting their foraging and orientation were also raised. And the fact that birds have these hollow piezoelectric properties with their feathers, this allows millimeter waves in the 5G range and other EMF to penetrate deep into the bird body cavities with likely detrimental effects. So a lot of things making it challenged to deal with migratory birds and addressing these issues. Other impacts from birds and other wildlife. So from 1980 to the present time, we've witnessed at least a 70-fold increase in ambient RFR. And this, of course, is growing. This affects us and virtually all wildlife 24/7, 365. There's been very little field research conducted on wildlife. However, many of the negative effects from EMF observed in lab research animals could be used as models and as predictors to wildlife in the wild. So something to consider. The biological effects of EMF are seen broadly across all taxa, including at frequencies of vanishing low intensities. EMF exposures are growing exponentially, found in virtually all habitats from urban to rural to wilderness. So we just can't seem to get away from it. By adding 5G to an already overcrowded bandwidth on top of thousands to tens of thousands more satellites and ground-based stations, we're impacting all wildlife on us in very troubling ways. Add to this virtually no environmental review by the Federal Communication Commission before the rollout of 5G, and the FCC's radiation standards now over 25 years out of date, still based on thermal heating. While we have much yet to learn, we already know a great deal about EMF, and we've referenced much of this in our paper, and we need to move on and address it. Some other take-homes regarding bats and wildlife. So bats avoid radar installations. They show heightened sensitivity to EMF through reduced foraging, reduced vigor, impacts to magnetoreception, migration, and other negative effects. Microchiroptera, these are our insectivorous bats, and many species of songbirds depend on insects for food. So if we're flooding the environment with, say, the 5G issues, these are going to impact the insect presence. Insect bodies can resonate or reach resonant matches with higher frequencies, such as those used at the top ranges of the 5G due to the insect's reduced size. There's great concern over the effects on beneficial insects, especially bees and other pollinators, as well as on bats, which are already in serious trouble. Short periods of exposure, even at much lower ranges, can lead to reproductive failure and death. Birds, bats, and insects often close to EMF sources from transmitting antennas, which humans are rarely, if ever, exposed, is a real problem. Some of the highest power densities are near TV and radio broadcast antennas, which are away from human populations. It's been assumed that if wildlife were impacted, they would abandon these sites for more favorable ones. Unfortunately, the evidence simply doesn't support that assumption due to the territories that birds in particular defend, home ranges, nesting, food availability, and the attraction of towers, both the birds and bats. Such exposures may simply damage wildlife but go unnoticed because it's so difficult to document, sort of the out of sight, out of mind mentality. Impacts likely from near field thermal effects as well as far field non-thermal effects, amongst other causes, need to be reviewed, as we mentioned in our paper. Some examples in mammals. We documented numerous adverse effects on EMF in mammals. This ranged from a variety of taxa, from bats, bovids, cervids, cetaceans, pinnipeds, and others. We raised concerns over domestic livestock and noted behavioral abnormalities in dairy cows near TV and radio antennas. Balmori, in another study, noted decreased populations of free-tailed bats close to several cell towers in Spain. Some examples of insects, pollinators, and arachnids. We noted decreased abundance and composition in wild pollinators, including DNA damage and effects to repair mechanisms. The 900 megahertz radiation affected ant feeding and other behaviors. Effects were noted on the reception and learning in bees, wasps, and monarch butterflies, including impacts on magnetite, the metal that's present in these species and in us. Reduced development in mating in honeybee queens was noted. Negative impacts affecting fruit flies were detected, and behavioral responses in ticks were also discovered. Examples in aquatic and marine fish and wildlife. Natal homing behaviors were impacted in sea turtles, eels, and salmon. RFR appears to be disrupting the Earth's natural geomagnetic fields. Concerns over the impacts to lobsters, crabs, marine, and freshwater fish were also noted. Other concerns over RFF included orientation and migration, food finding, impacts to reproduction and mating, nest, den building and maintenance, territorial and home range establishment and defense, longevity and survivorship in species, and concerns over RF impacts on species extirpations and extinctions. We're already in the Anthropocene, the 6th major extinction epoch, primarily caused by us, so the radiation issues are just adding another variable. And again, as I mentioned, wildlife and us for that matter are involuntarily being subjected to radiation 24/7, 365. There are a few steps to make cell phones safer and deal with transmission lines, but not much else has been done. A few other impacts. In addition to animals previously mentioned, we notice impacts to everything from locusts to nematodes, mollusks, amoeba, moles, algae, protozoans, to yeast and fungi, bacteria, viruses, and plants. So it's like, holy mackerel. The evidence indicates that EMF probably affects virtually all living organisms in negative ways, likely among all food chains and food webs in virtually all ecosystems on Earth. It's like, my God, you can't seem to get away from this. And there is one possible exception, and that is the deep sea extremophile organisms living in or next to the volcanic vents, provided there's no underwater cables present. Ironically, the ambient electronic fields from EMF, from ELF, extremely low frequencies, power lines and appliances creating these radiations, and RFR from virtually all of our broadcast and communication equipment are biologically active and may cause negative effects to all wildlife. The implementation of 5G is raising significant concerns for possible frightening outcomes may result. However, until populations of wildlife and plants are monitored, assessed, and estimated, we won't know if these organisms have reached or exceeded what we call the tipping points for extinction and what were the causes of their demise. The genie is clearly out of the bottle and it may be too late to put it back in, but we still must address EMF. From a federal government perspective, there's some things that could be done. With a growing level of published studies on EMF affecting migratory birds, other wildlife, and their habitats, early in 2014, I and several others at the Fish and Wildlife Service were instrumental in getting the Department of Interior to convince the First Responder Network, National Telecommunications Information Administration in the Department of Commerce to begin a National Environmental Policy Act, what we call NEPA review, using an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, to move forward in this study. This was the first time one department had convinced another department to conduct such a review. For more than a decade, several of us at Fish and Wildlife Service has previously tried convincing the FCC to approve and implement an EIS on EMF, especially that affecting migratory birds, but sadly with no success. While Commerce's Department NEPA review languished under the Obama administration and was ultimately scuttled under the Trump administration, the results of previous studies clearly showed radiation has impacts on wildlife, and therefore we need to proceed with further scientific study and review also for public consumption. The consequences of human health and safety are also implicit. This process needs to be restarted, and an EIS NEPA review needs to be reinitiated. Some other possible steps. So the FCC, as you'll hear shortly, lost two lawsuits on appeal, the American Bird Conservancy versus FCC 2008, where they continue to fail to adequately address the impacts of cell towers on migratory birds, and EHS versus FCC 2020, where FCC has failed to first justify their RF standards and secondly respond to the overwhelming evidence of wildlife and environmental health. Through rulemaking, FCC should resolve these outstanding RF issues by addressing the impacts from radiation, including radiation standards 25 years out of date based on thermal heating, which is generally not particularly applicable today in their court order, which we'll hear what's going on from additional speakers. Meanwhile, exposure and EMF emission standards for wildlife simply don't exist. However, if we're going to do that, or at least begin to try to address these issues, we need to get the Fish and Wildlife Service as well as the Environmental Protection Agency to develop wildlife standards if this is likely going to happen, which it probably sadly won't. This would require reorganizing frequencies and power densities for wildlife, which might be good for some species, but not for others. Admittedly, this is a huge challenge. Even if RF standards for wildlife were developed, for some species, there may be no safe thresholds, especially with the millimeter waves in the 5G spectrum. So one of the things that's going to make this even more challenging. At the very least, the FCC needs to publicly acknowledge real and potential EMF impacts to wildlife and work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, Department of Commerce, U.S. Geological Survey, the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and other agencies to begin to address them. The FCC sadly simply won't seem to budge. They continue to categorically exclude virtually all sources of impacts from radiation in their assessments and approvals, and they have yet to respond to the appeals court order to justify their antiquated RS standards and the thousands of pieces of environmental evidence presented against them in EHT et al. Versus FCC 2020. Suggested reading, Peter Alkine's ProPublica piece, which just came out a couple of days ago. The FCC is supposed to protect the environment. It doesn't, is really a very good and eye-opening read. Other options for wildlife. Our competitive communication system is completely out of whack. 5G should never have been foisted on us without a full health and environmental EIS review, which would have shown how likely dangerous this technology is for wildlife, most especially for pollinators, small reptiles, and amphibians, amongst others, not to mention us. FCC's approval of broadband frequencies for cell providers is also out of control. We don't need, for example, 6 providers licensed for the same specific areas, each with their own infrastructures and transmitters. Why the FCC failed to limit cell tech frequencies and keep them more narrowly focused is unclear. In part 3 of our reviews paper, we discussed air as habitat for wildlife. To make this safe and effective for wildlife, especially for imperiled species and wilderness habitats, at least in theory, we need to implement guiding principles of radiation safety based on human radiation safety standards, what we call ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. This means for imperiled species, particularly those that are threatened and endangered and threatened habitats, what we call critical habitats, we need to minimize the time spent near sources of radiation by reducing the exposure, maximize the distance between wildlife and the sources of radiation, and 3, place barriers between the wildlife and other sources of radiation, fencing and other means if possible. Unfortunately, keeping migratory birds out is going to be a real challenge. Given this massively growing amount of electrosmog and the exponentially increasing levels of EMF, and wildlife which have no respect for boundaries, making habitats safe for them is going to be a tall order, to say the least. Fish and Wildlife Service's Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. The Fish and Wildlife Service fully needs to implement and enforce their reconstituted take provisions, take meaning the unpermitted killing, injury, and crippling loss of migratory birds, which was published as a final rule in October of 2021. Enforcing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as incidental take provisions have been enforced for well over 100 years. This take provision must include the impacts from RFR, and the FCC needs to get on board in these issues. Endangered Species Act of 1973. Take provisions under the Endangered Species Act must also include impacts from EMF, and where the Endangered Species Act sections 7 and 10 can authorize incidental or accidental take, any provisions must be carefully developed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and where applicable, NOAA Fisheries to make these as scientifically credible as possible. For Canada and the EU, similar action should be taken for Canada's Species at Risk Act and its Migratory Birds Convention Act. The European Union should also update and enforce any radiation standards regarding its initiatives that address endangered species and habitat protections. So what we're doing with this unfettered use of EMF to our wildlife and habitats, in my opinion, is unconscionable. Wildlife belong to us all. This is a public trust. At the very least, we have a moral obligation to protect our planet and its wildlife and habitats. With the ongoing 6 major extinction epoch, primarily as a result of us, we're doing a really miserable job in addressing these issues. Things could change if enough pressure making our voices heard, for example, or people voting their consciences. We're focused on the communication industry, its corporate boards, and the regulators. That might make a difference. The communication industry really needs to be bird, bat, habitat friendly, and I would say we're clearly failing on that front as well. We need to make informed conservation decisions based on adequate environmental assessments and sound science. Briefly, from what I presented here, the evidence is overwhelming in favor of action. Clearly, there is a clarion call for a massive paradigm shift. Otherwise, the alternatives are grim for all parties concerned.
Thank you very much. May I ask a question briefly about the response from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to your publications that you co-authored?
Initially, the response was slow, I think in part because there were very few people within the agency that had any experience dealing with radiation. But the fact that we were able to convince the Interior Department to send that request for EIS notification to Commerce Department was pretty much unprecedented. So they ultimately came on board. Sadly, it got scuttled in the process, but we can restart that initiative. The precedent was set, frankly. So, and I think there was a lot of behind the scenes, yes, let's move forward in this, but people were just, staff were kind of, this kept things quiet, and the top management, I don't think really understood the concerns with radiation. So it was a beginning, but I think they're getting it now. At least I hope so.
Blake Levitt is an award-winning medical science journalist, author and editor who has researched the biological effects of non-ionizing radiation since the 1970s. She's participated in congressional briefings and published numerous peer-reviewed articles in the field, as well as several critical books.
This is a list of the 4 most recent studies. The approach that we took in this paper built on a 2010 paper that Dr. Henry Lai and I compiled in 2010. It was published in Canada's Environmental Reviews. It was the first time that anyone had attempted to tease out the vanishingly low intensity of biological effect studies that were particularly pertinent to far field exposures near cell towers. Henry Lai is a genius in searching extremely large databases and then culling out the exact right studies to look for various kinds of patterns. Henry in particular, but neither of us really expected to find much in the way of low intensity studies, and we were very, very surprised. But we went where the information led, and that's become one of Environmental Review's most read publications. It's had close to 75,000 downloads now, which is amazing for an academic paper. But the low-level intensity effects literature is exactly the kind of information that we need to establish what significant biological patterns might be. Unfortunately, it's that exact area of study that has been historically averaged away in meta-analysis, and therefore it's lost to important public policy information. Culling the right information is a form of analysis that goes far beyond just mere cherry picking, which is something that the industry often accuses people of. But meta-analysis has actually been the coin of the realm for industry for decades. Our 2010 paper directly challenged that. Beginning in 2016, Henry and I asked Al Banville, an esteemed wildlife biologist, to join the new effort, and we applied the same approach to non-human species, looking specifically to see whether there was enough data to be significant enough to include in the measured rising ambient levels of RF rather than just anecdotal reports, in order to match that to the low-level effects literature for non-human species this time. That is the kind of approach that had never been taken before. And yes, if there was that enough information in both of those categories, was there any correlation? And if so, for what species? Al, by the way, was our wildlife biologist and our policy wonk, and he's the one who kept all of our Latin nomenclature straight during the during the writing. It turned out not only was there enough research on increasing ambient levels, there was also an overwhelming amount of evidence in all 5 animal kingdoms and all taxa that were studied. Now, this surprised all 3 of us. Henry created very impressive tables of biological effects that are contained in the supplements in the first 2 sections of the paper, which are open access. Rising background levels, we cited overall general rising background levels. We cited 27 studies, which is quite a lot for something like that. It was something that people were only just recently doing too, primarily throughout Europe. Combined animal and floral studies had grown from 57 to 123 between our 2010 paper and the wildlife papers. Genetic effects, Henry teased those out from the general group of studies. For ELF, it was extremely low frequency. There were 12 studies. For RF, there were 47. That's just for genetic effects. The studies on flora were really surprising. We found for static magnetic fields, 16 studies. For pulsed magnetic fields, there were 5 studies. And for flora in particular, ELF magnetic fields, 8 studies, and for RF, 9 studies. We ended up citing over 1,000 papers, probably over 1,200 in the 3 papers, and many more have been added to the database since then. At some point, we'll probably update those tables. What we found was that low intensity studies in particular had greatly increased, as I said before, from 57 to 123. So you can't really ignore this, and you can't make it disappear in meta-analysis anymore. This low level effects literature is a whole different ballgame. Henry identified for the first time, which is really interesting, a pattern in the floral studies. Plants, trees, and seeds respond very positively to the Earth's natural static ELF fields. Or even artificially generated static ELF fields, but very adversely to alternating current ELF and particularly to radio frequency radiation. They really don't like anthropogenic energy directed at them. Most flora typically lives with multi-frequency exposures with their roots in the ground and their tops in the air. We don't think of it that way, but it's true. They get it from both sides. The wealth of the data took us actually to the ecosystem level for the first time, which had never been done before. No one had investigated the rising levels compared with the low level effects literature. So that was a first. That's what distinguishes them from everything else that had been done. Just by way of general background, I want to do a quick tour through this. All living organisms evolved in a matrix of environmental non-ionizing radiation. It's been assumed for thrived in these fields. It's logical to assume that man-made fields are unfamiliar to living organisms and could therefore disturb their normal physiological functions. That's just a bit of a no-brainer, that one, especially when you take low-level electrical microcurrent into consideration. That is a factor in all living cells, truth be told. Man-made fields are usually unusual signaling characteristics, including odd waveforms of modulations at intensities that are just not found in nature. Biological disturbance happens at these very low intensity, unfamiliar fields, far below the Earth's geomagnetic field, but it's similar to natural cellular biocurrent. The proliferation of wireless communications systems in particular may pose a dangerous challenge to living organisms on Earth. These novel EMF exposures do not allow living organisms actually to adapt or evolve or adjust since technology changes its signaling characteristics too rapidly, and new technologies are emerging constantly. So they just don't have time to adapt or evolve. What we're doing is just exposing them to something novel that hits them pretty hard, it looks like. There's been a steady global increase in ambient RF across all non-ionizing bands, but especially in the RFR ranges. Today, heightened levels are found in all urban, suburban, rural, and even deeply forested areas. In part 1, we went into pretty extensive research on that, having to do with cell technology now invading, so to speak, most of our national parks. We have a great deal of information on that, and a great deal of information from satellites too. We're on the cusp of an exponential increase in the ambient EMF RF from 5G development, in particular on land, but also in the lower atmospheric ranges from satellites. This could be a game changer, this one. 5G utilizes for the first time even more novel signaling characteristics than we have in all of the previous generations of civilian telecommunications. 5G uses what are called phased arrays with very high peak exposures, which are a biologically active exposure in and of themselves in a very unusual way. It includes something called massive MIMO, which is multiple in, multiple out signaling characteristics, and beam steering. The higher frequencies that are capable of affecting insect populations in particular. Quite simply, nothing like 5G, as it's currently designed, has ever really been used before in broad civilian applications. The upper ranges of millimeter waves have been used by the military for a long time, but nothing like this for at the scale that we're now building it out. 5G is being deployed without any kind of environmental review, as has been talked about, and Erica will hopefully address that too. The question is, are these increasing ambient levels adversely affecting wildlife in ways that are not yet determined? More than likely. And are there links to disappearing wildlife that are already being observed? Having to do with species extinctions, what are we looking at when it comes to a very broad view? Hal Manville calls this the 50,000 mile view. This is the 50,000 mile view. There's been an unprecedented rate of biodiversity decline between 1996 and 2022, and that's according to the International Union of Conservation of Nature. They keep a red list index that is highly respected, and anyone who's interested can go there. Current extension rates are now at least 100 to 1,000 times higher than natural rates that have been found in any fossil record. There's a great acceleration that's happening with this now. The Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in France in 2019 projected that at least 1 million plant and animal species worldwide are at imminent extinction threat if current human activities are not immediately reversed. Boy, if anything, that should be getting our attention, and it doesn't seem to be. One review of 73 reports found extinction rates had been greatly accelerated. Insects in particular show very dramatic declines that could lead to a 40% extinction rate over the next several decades. That really imperils everything all the way up the food chain. Please, Theodore, next slide. Affected insect groups include local regional niche insects as well as common generalist insects. That's what's been shown in lab stories and in some field studies, especially around the Greek Isles that we also go into detail in the papers. Many are critically important for pollination, and I'll skip that one because Al talked about that before. And humans are the primary cause. There are other things too. It's so easy for anyone who's involved with EMF studies to just throw everything but the kitchen sink at this one particular thing, but many other things are causing the species disappearances, including habitat destruction and degradation, overexploitation for food, pets, cattle, and medicine. Artificially introduced species are a big one. Pollination and contamination, of course, pesticides, disease, monoculture, agricultural practices, mostly for human edification, and of course climate change, which is probably the largest factor. Such global declines are really alarming. We're living in the age of the Anthropocene, and we're not sure in this day and age if we're going to be able to maintain human and wildlife integrity. Certainly nowhere near the levels that we've experienced in the past. The interesting thing about species extinctions is that those who study this say that climate change is not the only factor, that there is something new that's going on. We think that this is electromagnetic fields, ambient electromagnetic fields, and it should be added to the list of things that are involved with species extinctions. Rising EMF levels are ubiquitous, unrecognized environmental cyto and genotoxin. Increases in ambient levels between the 1980s and today directly parallel unprecedented species losses along with these other factors that I mentioned before. What adversely affects the environment, of course, affects non-human species, eventually affects humans too. That's a sort of a duh concept, but it's in there. We keep forgetting that. We think that we're somehow separate from the environment, and we're truly not. What we found in the paper was that, or something that we came to observe, is that we've actually been using animal, insect, microbial, and plant models in laboratory and in limited field studies for nearly 100 years. We actually understand how energy couples with many other species' unique physiologies better than we do our own. Something to consider. So we actually have a large database to draw from if we put it to use that way. All biological taxa have been well studied, including all 5 animal kingdoms, microbiota, and many plant species. But these data have traditionally been used to extrapolate information for human safety levels alone, not as protective information applied to the species that the experimentation and the research was done on, or what effects it might have to its habitat. Highly sensitive natural electroreception mechanisms. We went into a great deal of detail, interrelated detail having to do with mechanisms of action, because we knew that if we left that out, the paper would be incomplete. Mechanisms include specialized electroreceptors that other species have that we do not, ferromagnetic magnetite crystals, which are found in just about every species that's ever been studied. I'll talk a little bit about that in bees during Q&A if anyone's interested. Cryptochrome radical pairs that enable living organisms to detect the presence and immediate changes in the environment at very, very low intensities, far below what humans can perceive. Many species can be easily disturbed by the presence of these unfamiliar fields at very low intensities. That's what we found in the research. Please, Theo, new slide. Beginning in the 1940s, radiofrequency radiation impacts to species were among the first biological effects to be systematically studied in the hopes of discovering new forms of insect control. That's what they were looking for. And most of that research was done at thermal ranges. The side effect is actually that we have a greater understanding of insect electrophysiology and how various frequencies impact mating in all growth stages, as well as energy transfer and absorption. All insect metamorphic developments have been investigated too in our labs, including egg, larva, pupa, and adult stages. Interestingly, some adult species are actually more sensitive than at the more delicate, we would presume, larval stages, because adult insect appendages act as conducting pathways directly into the insect body. The same is said of the piezoelectric properties of bird feathers that Al had mentioned. We definitely need to take non-human physiologies into consideration, and we just are not doing any of that now. Insects are also very inefficient thermoregulators and are particularly vulnerable to temperature changes. This is something to especially keep in mind when it comes to 5G. They'll be experiencing both far-field and near-field exposure equivalents that will really do damage to them. And of course, what impacts insects impacts us all. 5G also with amphibians is a very serious concern. We could lose things like tree frogs, for instance, even in rural areas, if a great plethora of small cells goes on the new fiber optic cable. Anything that would affect them would be that. 5G in particular may impact insect populations as millimeter wave frequencies couple maximally with some insects. That would be the problem. Insects the size of fruit flies reach peak absorption in the upper microwave bands. Both thermal and non-thermal effects will likely occur to numerous insect species. Next slide, please. The Thalens studies were important. So I'm going to move quickly through these. I put these up mostly because I knew that Al would be going into good detail, but I just wanted to give people an idea of what's actually out there. Many environmentalists and regulators are completely unaware of the body of work of major reviews on this, and this will give you an idea of what some of them are. Those are just in the review category. And then there's, of course, what we went and did with ours. Next slide, please. Again, moving quickly, this just has to do with birds, various aspects of them, house sparrows. Again, I see Fernie's name down here. She's a Canadian researcher, and this is what we also found that was fascinating with the papers. There are pockets of researchers and labs throughout the world who have focused in on very individual species within, or individual species within species. And they've got a wealth of information. For instance, Fernie has focused in on ELF frequency ranges having to do with raptors, which we did not have before she stepped up to the plate. The same thing can be said of animal species. Some labs focus just on ants. This is some more on birds. Same can be said for insects. Ants, bees. Bees are very easy to study. Ants are very easy to study. Joseph Kirschvink has done the seminal work on discovering magnetite in various species. That's his bailiwick, and his work is well established. Vargova has taken a recent interest in ticks. Ticks, it turns out, are highly enthusiastic about radio frequency radiation. They actually stand up on their little legs, kind of have a bit of a field day in the presence of RF, and they can sort of take off in the direction of it. We've got studies on mammals, cows, bats. Rodent studies were, of course, the most numerous. They're so numerous that I didn't even go into detail with those. That's everybody's favorite lab study after insects like Drosophila and bees. Bacteria, protozoa, we've been studying that for a long time. Not so much viruses. Researchers can't even decide whether viruses are actually alive, so they tend not to use them in lab studies too much. Implications for the studies on bacteria have been initiated to see if there's any antibiotic resistance that RF or ELF contributes to, and yes, there certainly is. So there's enough to make a case when it comes to that as well. Just really want people to get an idea of what's out there. Amphibians, fish, and turtles. Aquatic environments are very different than air environments. Fish and turtles react and have evolved very close associations with the world's geomagnetic fields, but they're more impacted by ELF than they are radio frequency radiation. Radio frequency radiation is primarily having to do with ERA's habitat issues. The Lohmann Lab has done tremendous work on magnetoreception in turtles, as has Putman on magnetosensibilities and having to do with salmon migrations, these 1,000-mile migration patterns, and how ELF plays a very important role in that, natural ELF. Flora, these were the important ones that I had talked about, that we find there were over 200 studies on plants alone that Henry teased out the difference between ELF versus static ELF versus RF versus AC current. He did tables that distinguish between all of those different kinds of exposures. And what he found, like I said, was a pattern for the first time in the literature that found that plants like natural ELF and they don't like too much else. What can be done? Well, Al had talked about, the continued rise in ambient levels at 24/7 as a novel energetic air pollution. But it's really in rural and remote areas too. It makes it imperative that we consider broad effects to wildlife. We need to refund the US EPA and US Fish and Wildlife to investigate this work. Those would be the agencies. They've got no funding. They also have no expertise in-house that even knows how to ask for this funding. So we need to also fund staff positions in bioelectromagnetics within these agencies. We need to rebuild essentially what the US EPA used to have and no longer does. It's these exact RF bands between 30 gigahertz and 3 gigahertz now going up into the millimeter wave areas above 6 gigahertz that have increased exponentially, and is also a direct parallel with accelerating wildlife disappearance. There's no other pollutant that's increased in parallel like this during these exact years. That's the primary one. There are no exposures whatsoever for wildlife. That was a sort of a moment when we were doing this too. It hadn't been sort of part of the general lexicon that people understood that the standards that were in place were really only for human exposures. Now everyone is, or a lot of people are now recognizing, oh yeah, we've got nothing for wildlife. It's also important to determine if the ambient noise is reaching tipping points beyond which species simply cannot function. Al had talked about that. This is something that Henry had written about neurological effects going back to 1998. That's a long time. He's been at this a very long time. We need better understanding of magnetoreception's neural, cellular, and molecular processes. We need to understand ambient effects to wildlife, both direct and indirect, and also particularly synergistic. We need to know, one, if effects are cumulative, because they might not be, but they're sure are showing to be that exact thing. What compensatory mechanisms a species may have, we have no good information on that. And when or if homeostasis will deteriorate to the point of no return. That's really the fundamental question. Just to give people an idea, all biology is a swirl with microcurrent, and it's in electrodynamic coherence. We keep forgetting that. Historically, we focused on chemicals for both direct and indirect effects, such as endocrine disruption, for instance. But primary biological manifestation is actually more physical than it is chemical. The only thing that distinguishes one chemical from another on the periodic table is the amount of electrons being traded up and down on the scale. Chemicals are actually secondary manifestations of initial atomic principles, not the other way around. That's a mistake that we make in thinking about biological living systems. All systems are first and foremost expressions of biological energy in various states of relationship. And the synergistic effects with the Earth's geomagnetic fields are also important and biologically active and really cannot be ignored, even for humans. Carl Blackman, many years ago, back in 1985, discovered that if they didn't shield the labs at the EPA, that it could alter, it turned out to be a hidden variable in their research and therefore in all research. So we need to factor this into the much larger research picture. We've all evolved with electromagnetic fields. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity in human populations may actually be a sort of a negative result of very important survival functions. Al had gone through the relevant laws, so I won't spend any time on that. We went into great detail in part 3 for anyone who really wants to take a look at that body of research. Al was very articulate in part 3 about the relevance of that and how it could apply to environmental case law if we decided to go in that direction. In conclusion, really what we need is just a much larger vision. We have to stop thinking of other species, that they're here for human edification and at our sufferance. We need to leave them alone. They have a right to the planet as much as we do. We're the ones that are causing the damage, not them. And we need to take that into consideration and give non-human species a lot more respect than we're giving them. We need to incorporate the larger vision of aeroecology and air's habitat, as we had, as Al had talked about. He had introduced that concept to us, going back many years, and we go into great detail on that too, what it actually constitutes. We don't have anything like that now, but electromagnetic fields, particularly wireless technologies, would fall into perspective as the biologically active pollutant that it is, even at very low intensities, capable of affecting all species. So if we understood that, we would have a better handle on what we need to do in order to reduce exposures. The field of electroecology is where we all live, and we always have. We just didn't know it. It's time we recognize this and respect the fact that other species often have perceptual sensitivities that far surpass our own. And we need to reassess our love affair with technology and at least consider its potential impact to other species before we continue to deploy whole new devices and networks without taking anything into consideration except human convenience and efficiency, the efficiency of our system. So that's what we did, and that's where we are. And we floated all of that information into the universe, and there we have it.
Thank you so much, Blake. Great. So Erica Rosenberg is a retired FCC attorney. She served as Assistant Chief of Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division at the FCC, and she's going to share highlights of her article, Environmental Procedures at the FCC, a Case Study in Corporate Capture, which was published in Environmental Science Policy for Sustainable Development.
Thank you, Theodora. Some of you will know some of this about the FCC and NEPA, but just to lay out the basics, I'll say it anyway. The FCC, as you probably all know, regulates telecommunications, radio, TV, satellite, cable, wireless, wireline, and associated industries. Like all federal agencies, the FCC must also comply with NEPA. NEPA requires it to assess the potential environmental impacts of its major actions before it authorizes, funds, or licenses projects such as towers, antennas, and other communications infrastructure, and to consider the concerns of communities and citizens in the process. NEPA, as you probably know, has 3 levels of review, depending on the significance of the effect: environmental impact statement, EIS, for projects that are big, like a dam or mine, an environmental assessment for projects that may have a significant impact, and categorical exclusions for actions or categories of actions that have been determined not to have a significant environmental effect on the environment, either individually or cumulatively. Each agency promulgates its own NEPA procedures. Yet the FCC fails to comply with NEPA in a myriad of ways. It ignores major actions requiring environmental review, such as its distribution to industry of billions of dollars that support build-outs of updated wireless service or wireline service. To circumvent NEPA, it also improperly deemed certain actions as non-major, as the DC Circuit Court of Appeals found in 2019 with regard to its licensing of small cells. Its NEPA rules create an overbroad and unsupported categorical exclusion. That's an exemption from a NEPA assessment so that, for example, satellite licensing and submarine cables are categorically excluded from review. Among other impacts that you can imagine, these activities could result in light pollution, affecting both dark skies and migratory birds, and the destruction of underwater reefs. With little oversight or tracking, it delegates determinations of the level of environmental review for a project, that is, whether an environmental assessment is required or if the project is categorically excluded, to the industry proponents of the project. The proponents also draft the environmental assessments. Its environmental review process for industry is so perfunctory that it omits consideration of countless potential environmental effects, including aesthetic impacts and large-scale tree clearing. It fails to vigorously enforce its NEPA rules so that industry noncompliance is rampant. It fails to provide adequate notice and opportunities for public comment on projects as NEPA requires. It fails to make environmental documents establishing that a carrier did its due diligence, such as radio frequency emission studies, readily accessible to the public as NEPA requires. It routinely ignores or dismisses public comments so that it authorizes virtually all wireless projects as proposed, regardless of environmental concerns raised. These inadequate NEPA practices lead to a slew of environmental impacts. A representative but small sampling include impacts to critical habitat and endangered species. For example, in Puerto Rico, a tower builder bulldozed critical habitat for an endangered bird. Impacts to historic districts and cultural sites. Cell towers have been built on burial mounds and archaeological sites, and sacred sites have been destroyed or damaged. It impacts nationally and locally recognized scenic views. Towers have been built in the viewsheds of designated battlefields, national scenic trails, national byways, and on the sand dunes of tourist areas like Dewey Beach. And it impacts wetlands and forests. In 2019, licensees built a driveway in a forested wetland before completing environmental review. Given the FCC's lack of oversight and failure to comply with environmental laws, most violations that result in these impacts are unknown. The result of the FCC's lack of accountability is cumulative and incalculable environmental damage. Equally important, citizens and communities are left with little or no voice in citing decisions affecting them and their communities. As wireless technologies continue to proliferate, the impacts will likely multiply. In terms of what the lack of FCC's oversight and inadequate NEPA means for issues around RF, here are a few things. RF impacts on birds, bees, and wildlife are not considered a potential impact in the initial review by the applicant and are not considered a valid basis for additional review when raised in citizen complaints. Because most projects are categorically excluded, RF reports are generally not available to the public. In the rare instances that RF reports are submitted as part of an environmental assessment, they're required to be part of an environmental assessment. There's no agency effort to review them for accuracy, and these reports are reportedly quite inaccurate. There is no registry for wireless facilities. Only certain macro towers need to be registered, so there's no tracking of small cells or antennas. There's no environmental monitoring of RF levels by the FCC or any other agency for that matter. There is little to no follow-up on complaints about RF exceedances once a tower is built, and there are no compliance checks and no enforcement. And in terms of 5G, the FCC has never done an EAS, and it did not do an EIS for the 5G rollout. Over the years, a few NGOs have tried to improve agency accountability and NEPA compliance. Unfortunately, these efforts have been largely unsuccessful. However, the Council on Environmental Quality, which is the agency that oversees NEPA compliance, is requiring federal agencies to revise their NEPA rules. Hopefully, the Council can hold the FCC to a higher standard than it did the first go-around.
And what do you see as the really important thing for the public to understand about next steps to address all of these failures?
In terms of what the public can do?
Yeah, in terms of what the public can do and communicate to their elected officials, you know.
Yeah, I think that would be the way to go, because I think elected officials really need to know about this complete disregard of congressional law, as all law is. But, you know, and I think citizens can just raise their concerns and ask for more oversight of the agency, both in RF and other environmental effects. It's just, it's basically their intransigence on complying with NEPA writ large, not just about RF.
I'm sorry you have to leave. I was going to ask you a bunch of questions, but
Do
you think that some of what's happened at FCC has to do with the defunding of other agencies that might be available to answer their questions on this subject, particularly EPA? They seem to only have FDA to rely on now. And FCC is absolutely clear that they rely on other agencies to provide them biological information, and they have no one to rely on. There's no there behind them saying that.
I think that is a problem, but based on what I know of the FCC, that is not their main problem. I mean, the main problem is they have no interest in in studying other effects or promulgating a standard that is protective of the public. My sense is they do what industry wants. They're a captured agency, and I think they're fine with EPA not having set a standard or anything, or looked into these things more.
Yeah, but back in 1996, I think it was, EPA really stepped up and insisted that FCC adopt the NCRP regulations for civilian exposures. That's how they ended up with a 2-tier recommendation. And it was because EPA, you know, at the time stepped up. It had the right people in house that understood the subject.
Huh. That's great. But I'm sure the FCC felt cornered then.
Yeah, they did.
It's not like they voluntarily said, "Oh, let's find the right standard that protects the public." Right.
I know. But it's even worse now that they don't even have that. I think is the thing. They've got nowhere to go. They are still cornered to some extent. I mean, who are they going to ask?
Right, it's a problem, and they have no or little in-house expertise too. And same with NEPA, they don't really have the expertise to be reviewing environmental assessments.
Yeah,
and
Oh, so it's going to take restructuring some of the other organizations as well as legislation to make that happen.
I think so.
Oh, that's a Mount Everest climb, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And if several people have raised RF impacts on wildlife and as a complaint about a given tower that's being proposed, and they just bat away they just throw away the argument, dismiss it very readily.
Yes.
So
yes.
It's not like they'll say, "Oh, well, we'll look into this and we'll talk to biologists about this." So,
thank you, Erica. Daniel Favre is now going to talk about his published study, Mobile Phone-Induced Honeybee Worker Piping.
So I am formerly a biologist. I am living in Switzerland. My mother tongue is French. I am teaching science and German. And I worked during 22 years as a postdoc in virology. And it was only 2008 when I started to study honeybees. Because at that time we spoke about colony collapse disorder, and the explanations were this is due to the varroa mite infestation of the hives. This was due to pesticides or even strong winters. And actually the idea was this does not explain 40% of all losses around the world. So I was advised to perform experiments with honeybees. So I started with this first study that was conducted with colonies in 2008 and 9 and was published in 2011. Basically, the idea is the following. You have to listen to the noise that the colony is performing in the hive. So for that, you just install a microphone to record the sounds that are made by the honeybees. In Switzerland, we have two types of hive. We have the Dadenblatt and the Burki hive. So basically, you record the sounds, and then you go to the computer and you analyze either with audiograms, the strength of the sound, or spectrograms, the frequency, what is going on in the hive. And here, I don't go into details, but you listen, for example, here, what are doing honeybees when they are not disturbed by anything. This is a sound, basically 200, 300 hertz, pulsations per minute, and it can last hours and hours and hours. So nothing special is happening. The bees are happy. So next, to check whether mobile phones would have putative effect on this behavior, you install two handsets. One handset is emitting, at that time it was 900 megahertz, and the other one is receiving the signal. And what happened is that when these mobile phones are put on, it takes half an hour to 3/4 of an hour to induce a change in the behavior of the honeybees. So they are becoming disturbed, and they make very many other noise that are called worker piping. And these example here allow you to listen what is going on with disturbed honeybees when mobile phone has been put on. I have plenty of these sounds. And when you know the behavior of the honeybees, this type of sound is one of the two signals that are required to induce the swarming. Swarming is when the colony is leaving the hive with the queen. And this sound was repeatedly recorded when mobile phones were installed very close to the honeybees. So one drawback was that I was asked, do these mobile phones heat? And this is due to the heating of the mobile phones, because here they are very close to the hive, the colony. To my opinion, it was not the heat of the mobile phone, but the EMFs. So the idea was to perform another experiment. And this experiment is here on the left. It was to induce this behavior with a very simple system that is consisting in receiving and emitting antennas, very small antennas, and a system that take the ambient EMFs. We can send these EMFs close to the hive, but outside the hive, without any heating effect. And this was performed and published in a not so well-known scientific journal of behavior. And usually you need 10 experiments to publish. And here I was stopped by very angry honeybees when I did want to start the number 6 experiment. And I can tell you that when you go with your material to your apiary and you try to do this experiment, sometimes the bees recognize you and they still maybe know what you are going to do. And I published this with only 5 experiments. And this was conclusive because the honeybees were also very disturbed by this system when you have an emitting antenna in the surroundings, which signal is taken by this system and emitted close to the hive. So now here you have only one microphone. You just listen to the sound that is made in the hive. And years later, it was experiments that were started in 2010, 2011. I like New Year's Eve. And my question was, do my honeybees also like New Year's Eve? Because 10, 12 years ago, I noticed that when a microphone was put in a hive the 31st of December, close to 11 o'clock in the evening, suddenly the bees started to become very, very noisy. And this was lasting 2-3 hours. This was 10 years ago. And in the year 2019, I put a microphone into a hive at my home. And I started to record early in the afternoon until the 1st of January. And to my surprise, there was not only one peak of disturbed honeybees close to 12 o'clock in the evening, but many peaks already present early in the afternoon. And interestingly, these peaks were separated, most of them 1 hour from each other. And there is here a hole from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning, and then nothing. And this gave me the hypothesis that this disturbance was due to not only the New Year's Eve here in Switzerland, but to New Year's Eve occurring according to jet lags. So here maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon, here we have the New Year's Eve in China, India, and so on. Here you have New Year's Eve every half an hour in Eastern countries. And here you have Europe, here we have London, and then you have the whole for the Atlantic, nothing will be emitted here. And here you have the East Coast of the United States. So this was 2019, when people usually sent their SMS messages, phone calls around 12 o'clock. And these last 2 years, this was not observed because I think people have changed their behavior. They are not sending their messages close to New Year's Eve exactly, but all the day. So more work is required to confirm this work. And my third and last slide is the following. Here on the left, you have the EMF effects on honeybees. Many things are reduced. So for honeybees, the flight activity, pollen foraging efficiency, returning to the hive, the bee strength, the egg laying rate by the queen, and the honey and pollen stores all are reduced due to these EMF effects. References are here. You also notice misdirection in flight. They are wrong with 10 degrees, so they don't go directly to the place where they have to forage, but they have misdirection during the flight. And Thielens, that was mentioned previously, published changes in behavior, physiology, and morphology. So for us, what does it mean? And if you consider that fruits and vegetables must be pollinized by not only honeybees, but by bumblebees, you have a reduction in the pollination of fruits and vegetables, so you have less food. So the question is, can we manage this with the forthcoming 5G? But all these experiments are already present with the 2G, 3G, 4G. So the question is, where do we go with this electromagnetic pollution? This is an open question. So I am finished and I am ready to answer to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your research. Dr. Cornelia Waldman-Selsum, who is a medical doctor, is going to present her research on trees. She is co-initiator of the Physician Initiative Banville Appeal. And in her visits to over 1,600 affected people living in the vicinity of mobile phone towers, she observed that in addition to the people who were sick, there were trees that developed injuries at the same time. And she's documented tree damage from over 1,000 mobile phone base stations, and she's going to share her publications and follow-up research.
Between 2004 and 2009, we visited 1,600 patients who lived near mobile phone base stations. They showed us that at the same time when their symptoms started, trees nearby also started to change and to develop damage. We became very concerned when we observed ground damage on just one side of a tree, which was the side facing a mobile phone base station. Like on this photo, you see an unilateral damage. We marked all base stations in the map of Bamberg and Hallstatt with the main beam directions of the sector antennas. Around every base station in Bamberg and Hallstatt, we found trees which showed damage only on one side. That's why we began to document the trees. Main beam and side beams are vertically and horizontally focused. Here you see series over some years. On the exposed sides, leaves turned yellow or brown and fell off early in the year. In the following years, crown became more and more transparent. Outer branches died off. The opposite side has often remained intact for many years because the radiation is attenuated by leaves and needles. RF radiation is absorbed and scattered. In 2015, we asked the biologist Balmori for advice. Immediately, he made the plan for our study. We selected 60 damaged trees, 30 randomly selected trees, and 30 in low radiation areas. We did measurements on the damaged and on the opposite sides. The measurements of all trees revealed significant differences between the damaged side facing a phone mast and the opposite side. Thus, we found that side differences in measured values of power flux density corresponded to side differences in damage. The 30 selected trees in low radiation areas showed no damage. Our trees showed no signs of infestation by insects, fungi, worms, or viruses. You can, in our study, you can read about every tree in tables. And I want to show you examples. Here you see a maple tree. It started in 2008. On the left side, there was already branches lost. In 2015, the time of our study, you see on the left side, leaves already fallen down. The color is brown. On the red side, which shows away from the base station, is still green. And the following years, the tree had to be cut back several times. It still stands there, half of the tree. Here is a lime tree. It started in 2009 on the right side. The leaves are brown. 2015 on the right side, the tree had lost many leaves. And down you find always the measurements on the right side, 3,800, on the left side, 420. Also, this lime tree had to be cut back. Here, a Douglas fir. In 2007, we saw this strange geometry of a tree. On top and on the right side, no needles. And then I took the photo always from southeast. 2008, you see there's only the quarter of the tree. And then later on, the tree lost the branches. And in March 2023, you see still the tree there, but only a quarter. Here, on the way to the cathedral in Bamberg, you see a maple tree. Many people are passing when they visit the cathedral and the residence in Bamberg. There we saw already in 2008, leaves getting brown in August from year to year, because this was a place so famous. So I thought when I write to many people, they will be shocked. Here you see in 2012, side difference. There was radiation from east and from south, because many people passed there. In 2015, you see there are already, the tree had been cut back and branches fell down suddenly. So it became very dangerous. And you see in 2021, the tree was felled. Here is a tree from group 3. The group where they were in a radio shadow of the buildings, and you see this maple tree can still grow very well. And in October had all leaves and grown. Then we went to many cities, as Theodora already said. We were at 1,000 mobile phone base stations. And I show only 2 examples. In Göttingen, in the botanical garden, even we saw differences in tree pairs. And it was very easy when you start going around and when you know where the base stations are, or when you look at the base stations, you find very fast, you find the examples. This is in the World Heritage Bergpark Wilhelmshöhe in Kassel. There it is a beach. The distance is 1 kilometer, 400 meters. And it became worse in the next 2 years. And this beach had also had to be felled. In March 2023 in Munich, in a garden, suddenly a beech fell down. Here I want to show that it becomes very dangerous. In the last weeks in Germany, there are many trees which suddenly fell down. And now now I hope that people will think about the problem. What our new project is this year to go at many rivers and lakes, because we find the damage also where water is, where you find enough water. Here this is a camping site, very dangerous with the damaged trees where branches can fall down. And you see in the background the phone mast. And what we measured was here 200 microwatt per square meter. It's far, far below the limits, but we see the damage. And what we always do is in the maps, what helps very much to find quickly the damage is we have for many maps, we put the base station and the main directions, and then we go around in the main directions, and in the woods, we find, like this, we can find the damage. And here is a very famous lake in Germany, the Chiemsee, an island with a castle von Ludwig, and even there, it's 4 kilometers from the next phone mast there, you see many trees, different species, which we had much damage. Here also the map where you can see where the sector antennas go in which direction and where we found much damage. Here only one example for woods. We have been in many woods and we found new clearings. And when we draw the maps, we saw that the clearings started where the main directions were on the hill. I have much hope the trees make the impact of radio frequency radiation visible. And that's why I hope that the trees can help us. We did this work with the trees because we had the experience that the people who suffered, that the authorities did not believe the people. So that's why we did this with the trees. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What has been the response to your research and your ongoing research? I know that you have done reports since the publication of this study.
The authorities, they don't, they refuse to do studies. What we always ask at the beginning, it was new for us, we always ask, please do studies. We see these damages and nobody wanted to do studies, but at the moment it is so that there are scientists who realize that there must be a connection, and this is my hope, and I wait, and we talked to many scientists. We hope that there are people who dare to say we have to look at this, and the people who have much loss with the woods. It's very dangerous now in the woods, and there are many trees die off. So I do hope, because it becomes so dangerous.
I'm the president of Environmental Health Trust, an organization that's been around now for 15 years, and we have been working along with colleagues such as those you've heard from earlier today to make sure people understand the full impact of electromagnetic fields on our lives and those of everything around us. Every living being, from plant to animal to humans, is alive because of electromagnetic fields and is subject to them. And we at Environmental Health Trust have worked tirelessly to document those impacts through a series of scientific meetings and publications that you can find on our website. Today, I'm going to talk just briefly about research I was privileged to do with Malka Halgamug. She is an expert in computer science and information systems. She produced an article in 2017, which looked at the impact of weak radio frequency radiation and its impacts on plants. And in that study, she found that in almost 9 out of 10 of the studies she looked at found significant impact on the physiology or morphology, that is the functioning or the shape of these plants. And the plants were particularly vulnerable if they were maize, roselle, pea, fenugreek, duckweeds, tomato, or onions. And plants, like people, are more responsive to certain frequencies. Subsequent to meeting her, she and I then did an analysis further, and we looked at the specific types of impacts, and we specifically looked at different algorithms that can be applied. And what we showed was that if you looked at DNA damage in plants, and you can look at DNA damage directly in plants, you can look at chromosomal aberrations in plants, and micronuclei, which are exquisitely sensitive measures of DNA functioning, that you can predict from the RF EMF studies how those plants will be affected adversely. And we were able to show by the different systems of classification that there was a significant effect on these plants, looking at different types of data within the system and looking at different algorithms for looking at patterns in these studies. What makes the plant studies particularly pertinent is that when you look one level up at the tiny little zebrafish, which is an animal that has been well studied in toxicology for years, you find something very interesting. A 2020 study looked at whether or not there were birth defects, teratogenic effects in embryos and did not follow those animals to further development, even though they showed some subtle indications of suppressed activity in things like a startle response. But a subsequent study looked at greater detail and let those embryos grow to adults. And what they found is that the embryos that grew to adults had a significant damage to their behavior as measured by a number of, again, standard assays that we look at in these laboratory animal fish. And the effects were at frequencies used in 5G. Now, in 2021, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia issued a ruling based on a lawsuit that we filed in 2020. Our lawsuit challenged the FCC when it said, trust us, there's no need to revise any of the standards that we've had for cell phones or related devices, which were set in 1996. The same limits that were set then should apply now to all of this technology that is going to be unfolding. And what the court did is it actually looked at the evidence. And the most important thing it said is that it could not find any indication that the FCC had actually read the substantial record of scientific evidence on long-term exposure, the vulnerability of children. And the 2021 decision specifically said that the FCC had completely failed even to acknowledge, let alone to respond to comments concerning the impact of RF radiation on the environment. Environmental effects have never been considered by the FCC in deciding what the standards ought to be. So as a consequence of that ruling, we're now in a situation where we have been, as Senator Blumenthal noted years ago, flying blind. There has been no one paying attention to the need to protect wildlife, plants, or animals, nor frankly for the rest of us. And now we've provided additional evidence to them in the past year. Environmental Health Trust actually submitted work done by Albert Manville, Blake Levitt, Henry Lai, and others. So the FCC currently has that, which they have also not acknowledged, nor is there any indication that they are taking seriously what this court ruling said to them in 2021. Thanks to the efforts of all of you on this call today, we hope to change that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am Executive Director of Environmental Health Trust, and I want to briefly talk about another critical issue that we need to be doing an entire webinar on, so stay tuned on that. And that is on the increased energy usage of 5G and new networks. Now, the power consumption per unit of traffic is greatly decreased, but the power consumption of 5G increases greatly compared to 4G because of the equipment. It is power-hungry equipment, and the industries themselves have white papers on this. This is from a Huawei paper called 5G Power White Paper. There's actually many publications scientifically on this issue where they talk about the increased power consumption of 5G and these new networks that are being rolled out across the country. And sometimes they're being turned off, of course, when not in use because of the exceptional increase in energy.
So your report is about 5G energy consumption. Isn't 5G much more energy efficient than 4G?
It has proven to be 90% more energy efficient than 4G in terms of energy consumption per unit of traffic. But it is still expected to cause a dramatic increase in energy consumption due to the implementation of massive MIMO and the level of network densification. A 5G base station requires 3 times more energy to provide the same coverage as a 4G network, burdening network operators with high energy costs and a capital expense.
Now, the University of Sussex Business School in 2022 did a literature review on whole network level assessment of the operational energy use implications of 5G. They looked also at the embodied energy usage associated with 5G, all of these new devices, new small cells, there's macro cells, the network has, devices, antenna, base station antennas, and of course, increased consumer usage. All of this far outswamps the energy efficiency gains that companies and researchers are working on. So I'd like to read a quote from the University of Sussex Literature Review. The widespread adoption of unlimited data subscriptions for 5G users and the facilitation of advanced and data-intensive mobile services such as virtual reality and more sophisticated mobile gaming could encourage energy-intensive user practices, contribute to ever-growing levels of data traffic, and counteract the energy-saving potential of 5G efficiency improvements. Now, there are numerous reports, not only published papers, but also the French High Council for Climate report on controlling the carbon impact of 5G. The German Federal Environment Agency report in 2020 found that network access via wired broadband uses less energy than mobile. The Shift report. There's also scientific publications and industry white papers, which you can find at the Environmental Health Trust website under 5G energy consumption. You can go to that webpage. And of course, there are articles by Katie Singer and Miguel Coma on this, and also YouTube that I did with Katie Singer, where we talked about the energy consumption of that video interview. And just like you watching this right now, we're using energy. There are a lot of practices that can be done to reduce energy, both at the consumer level as well as at the corporate level. But the problem is that there's just more and more billions of new devices. Think about how many wireless devices in your home there are now compared to what you had 10, 20, 30 years ago. Everything has a charging cord. Everything uses power. To make those devices, to get the raw minerals for those devices, to manufacture those devices, there are costs, environmental costs, and also many human rights abuses, not to mention e-waste. Whole other issue is what happens after. So the total life cycle issues really need to be addressed, and they're not. Instead, it's just more. And yet the wireless industry has a PR campaign on how green 5G is. This is Meredith Adwell Baker. She's the president and chief CEO of the CTIA, that's the Wireless Association, in a butterfly dress at the 5G conference. And she was previously FCC commissioner, also previously acting administrator at the NTIA, that's the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And before that, she was a wireless industry CTIA, that's the Wireless Association, lobby association of the United States of all the wireless companies. And she was director of congressional affairs and former lead lobbyist for NBC Universal. This is from the CTIA Wireless Industry 2022 Summit, where they had talks, including policymakers, on how 5G was going to help the earth. Here you can see the cutout that reminds us of our most loved children's books. And of course, they have some nice green trees, and there's all kinds of imaging of a beautiful and healthy earth with cell towers popping up. Baker in a butterfly dress not only exemplifies the revolving door between government and industry, but of course, the greenwashing and environmental washing that's going on in regards to this issue.
Climate change is a global imperative. America's 5G networks are a big part of the solution. 5G is unleashing new use cases across industries that will help America meet 20% of its emissions reduction goals by 2025. How? New driverless cars and connected transportation systems will remove as much carbon as 106 million acres of forests. 5G-enabled production lines and machinery will optimize energy consumption equivalent to eliminating emissions from 156 million barrels of oil. A truly connected smart grid will support the adoption of greener forms of energy and have an impact equal to swapping 205 million incandescent light bulbs for highly efficient LEDs. Farms will be able to make more efficient use of water, monitor their crops, and automate operations, offsetting the impact of burning 30 billion pounds of coal. And 5G-enabled telehealth visits, remote work, and other day-to-day improvements will save enough energy to power 5.3 million homes. Together, that's like taking 72 million cars off the road. 5G is fighting climate change and transforming the way we live and work.
The market is flooded with wireless devices for every age group. These are speakers for kids, Amazon Echo Dot Kid speakers that are birds and panda bears. Then there are honeybee cell phone cases with slogans of Save the Bees. And in fact, if you go online, there are tons of bee cases and honeybee and animal paraphernalia for your phone. The United States EPA has sent me 2 letters clarifying the complete lack of federal accountability when it comes to the issue of biodiversity, wildlife, and so forth. They repeated the same response to almost every question I asked, and these are 2 very long letters with a lot of questions. So for example, I asked, what U.S. agency has reviewed the research on damage to trees from cell phone radiation? They stated that they do not have a funded mandate for radio frequency matters, and they're not aware of any EPA reviews that have been conducted on this topic. And they don't know if any other U.S. agencies have reviewed it. I asked about birds and bees. The response was the same. The EPA Director of Radiation Protection, Lee Ann Veal, wrote these letters to me in 2020 and 2023. I also asked, would the EPA be more transparent with the public about what it is and what it is not doing? Like, for example, clarify on their websites that they haven't done any review. Because right now, when you go to the website, it just says go to the FCC, as if it was nodding to the FCC as somehow having an opinion regarding safety or environmental health or anything, really, any kind of safety determination. And the EPA repeatedly stated to me that it has not done any scientific review and has no funded mandate. And so here we are, where birds nest and perch on transmitting cell antennas. And these are images of fake trees, which are cell towers. The wireless companies refer to them as monopines. So I want to sum up the regulatory gap issues that we have. There is no federal limit for magnetic fields in the United States at all. The limits that we have for wireless have been unchanged since 1996, and they do not consider the science on wildlife or on impacts to plants or animals. There's no environmental monitoring of the increasing ambient electromagnetic field levels. There's no surveillance for impacts to biodiversity. And there's no federal agency with environmental expertise that is actually reviewing the science on wildlife impacts. The European Union has done some research, but no government has actually included wildlife in their regulatory decision-making, with the exception of India, which significantly lowered its limits to 1/10 of their previous ICNIRP-based limits after review of the impacts to wildlife. There was a 2012 interministerial report where the Ministry of Environment and Forests and other experts reviewed the research on birds, bees, plants, humans, and other wildlife. And they actually ended up publishing a paper on that report as well. And they concluded that while there were significant research gaps, the vast majority of published literature indicated deleterious effects of EMFs in various species. The report recommended more stringent radiofrequency radiation limits, that electromagnetic fields be recognized as a pollutant, with regular auditing of EMF levels near schools, hospitals, and ecologically sensitive areas, that there be legislation to protect flora and fauna in urban areas, and that there be measures such as the removal of wireless installations in wildlife conservation areas. Now, the limits that they set at 1/10 lower, which is quite substantial, and 1/10 lower than US limits, still are not science-based safety thresholds for wildlife. They are not protective. However, they are a step in the right direction. Because of this egregious regulatory gap that we have in the United States, some states have taken actions in order to protect their communities. So the New Hampshire Commission on 5G Health and Environment, after a year of investigation by expert scientists, they issued 15 recommendations to protect the public and the environment. And their 2020 report lists them and also has the rationale for them. So please, if you're not aware of this, go and download the New York Commission on 5G Health and the Environment. 2 of their recommendations are pertinent here. They called for the engagement of agencies with ecological knowledge to develop radio frequency radiation, that's wireless safety limits, that will protect the trees, plants, birds, insects, and pollinators. They stated that under the National Environmental Policy Act, the FCC should do an environmental impact statement as to the effect on New Hampshire and the country as a whole from 5G and the expansion of radio frequency wireless technologies. Now, our organization, Environmental Health Trust, actually did a FOIA, a Federal Public Information Request, to the FCC about 5G. And we asked if they'd done an environmental impact statement or any kind of environmental review before rubber stamping or streamlining 5G small cells with the legislation that was put forward by the FCC in 2019. We were sent back a document stating that it was all redacted. There were documents that were redacted. And we believe that there was a question. We believe that there was the question posed by FCC or other staff related to, shouldn't we do an environmental review, being that we're about to fast track over 800,000 new wireless facilities in the United States to tie together 5G and the Internet of Things. Of course, that never happened. Maine just put forward a bill, the resolve to study the effects of 5G technology on bird, bee, and insect population and the effects of long-term exposure on children. And in fact, there is a hearing you can watch online in the Maine Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee.
Our birds, bees, and pollinators have built-in navigation systems that are meant to be synchronized with the Earth's electromagnetic field. That's how they get back and forth to their nests and hives. The science shows the increasing electropollution is dysregulating their navigation systems. 4G, or fourth generation technology, uses long waves to carry data and signals. 5G, or fifth generation, uses these longer waves too, but is now adding an additional layer of short millimeter waves that are about the same size as many of our pollinators.
And as I understand it, that bill is being modified and may look more like a commission such as New Hampshire had. So we need federal accountability on environmental impacts at every level. We need an evaluation of the environmental impact of 5G and new wireless networks. We need monitoring of the electromagnetic field levels in the environment. Many countries already do that. What are the levels now? What were the levels 10 years ago? What are the levels going to be in 10 years? We need that data. We need surveillance for impacts to biodiversity. There should be surveillance for impacts to birds, bees, insects. Dozens of countries monitor the electromagnetic field levels in their communities. And India found last year over 300 sites to be out of compliance. So why aren't we doing that? Why are we leaving it up to the companies to take measurements? But we are. That is how it works in the United States. No oversight, no monitoring. The EPA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of the Interior need to be doing this research and monitoring the research that's being published around the world. There needs to be protection via EMF exposure limits that consider flora and fauna. And we need compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, as everyone has spoken about today. Environmental Health Trust is taking this issue on. We have a wildlife project. We are working with legal and policy experts on the best approach to address the regulatory gaps that we have. So please stay tuned on that. There are other organizations working in this space, and we hope many more. Peer, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, has worked on telecommunications networks in parks and forests and address the cutting down of trees that happens for the equipment, the roads and so forth. NRDC did an amicus brief in our case, and it is really an important read on the environmental issues related to wireless networks and also the history of the issue in the United States. In addition, the Berkshire Litchfield Environmental Council did an amicus brief in the Montgomery County versus the FCC case. That was a very important case because basically the county argued that how can the FCC streamline 5G when they haven't closed their inquiry?
Montgomery County's concern is what the FCC has yet to say. In response to rulemaking comments that the FCC's RF exposure standards may not reflect the current safety research, or account for this new 5G environment that we're going to see in the coming years. And that the FCC must resolve those issues before accelerating the siting and the operation of these 5G small cells on public rights of way. The FCC offered a single sentence. It said it disagreed with any concerns that Montgomery County or others have.
Now, unfortunately, when that case came to oral argument, the FCC had made its decision in 2019 that they did not need to change their limits. The case did not lose on merits. It was considered moot. And actually now, of course, it's no longer quite moot. I think that would be a legal question because the FCC was found to have not adequately reviewed the record before them when they made that decision. The amicus brief in that case by the Berkshire Litchfield Environment Council is really an excellent review of the issue. I do recommend it. There is going to be a lot going on in this space coming up, not just with the organizations that I've mentioned and Environmental Health Trust, but also with other environmental organizations as they learn about this. And in fact, one piece of our project is going to be educating those organizations so that they can join in helping to lift this issue. It deserves attention. It deserves a place in the discussion about the impacts to wildlife and what we're seeing right now in terms of ecological damage from industry. The research studies presented on this webinar are all in PubMed. I put the links in the chat, or you can go to Environmental Health Trust, where we have web pages on the science. We also created, in collaboration with Prevent Cancer Now and C4ST Canadians for Safe Technology, a website called wirelessenviroimpacts.science, which is about the electromagnetic radiation and impacts to biodiversity. We also will be putting together a website related to U.S. issues quite specifically, and we hope that you will stay tuned, connect with us. Please join our newsletter to stay in touch on this issue. If you want to read some investigations on this issue, I recommend a couple articles to start. One is the ProPublica article entitled, "The FCC is supposed to protect the environment, it doesn't," by Peter Elkind. And that's one of a series of articles on telecommunications and on the FCC that he has done. It talks about satellites and cell towers and also features Erica Rosenberg, who was on this call earlier today. Katie Alvord published Is Wireless Technology an Environmental Health Risk in the Society of Environmental Journalists Journal. The University of Washington Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies published an article called What Will 5G Mean for the Environment by Claire Curran. Has there ever been a NEPA review at the US level?
Not at the EIS level for certain. There have been a few EAs, environmental assessments conducted, but as you mentioned, earlier FCC categorically excluded most of those. So no, there's I would say a significant need for an EIS. And that's why I recommended we need to go back and do the project with Department of Commerce. Be a good start, be a good opportunity to do a scientific study of what's going on here with the frequencies other than 5G, and then do a separate study on 5G, trying to tease out what's actually happening, so we can get a much better handle on what's going on. That will take time. EISs at the very least take at least 18 months to conduct. This one probably, if we're going to do this right, would be a number of years. But I don't see any move to make that happen, at least not from the agency perspective.
I also want to clock in on that one. The only one that I'm aware of actually was a environmental impact statement, and the Navy, the military, issued a draft environmental impact statement. That was the Navy's military upgrade over their wargaming facilities over the Olympic Peninsula, and that was quite a hearing. Fundamentally, what the Navy was doing was greatly increasing their noise, especially having to do with introducing growler jets into. It's considered the loudest machine on Earth, and they were introducing it over the Olympic Peninsula, which has been called the quietest place on Earth. And they did this with no sense of irony whatsoever. It was a massive upgrade to wargaming, underwater, over water, and over air. And there was a environmental review, but it was so narrowly done that as to be meaningless. It turned out this was what we discovered, Al, when we were involved with this. And I think they asked for your participation in some of this. This goes back quite a number of years now, so I don't blame you for not remembering. And I think that I sent you information on it. I was tied up with other things, and I didn't understand the importance of what they were trying to investigate. But what they did was they ended up very narrowly focusing on two endangered species, which was the marbled murrelet and the And what they ended up saying was that the marbled murrelet, since it was migratory, wouldn't be affected all the time, so it would be fine. And the owl was under the tree canopy, so that wouldn't be affected either. Nobody was taking noise into consideration. They had a very minimal review of EMF exposures. You could just tell that nobody knew what they were talking about. I did, when I was researching this for Section 1, of the wildlife papers, I ended up going to a lot of the original papers that were filed that were still online at the time. They were subsequently taken down, and tried to figure out exactly what they would be using. It ended up being interesting, but there is that in part one, if anyone wants to investigate it. It was considered, including by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, it was considered pretty much of a failure of a study. That they just kind of ended up rubber stamping this thing. And one thing that I would like to say is that on the one hand, we really do need the military to be well trained, especially in complex environments. This represented an extremely complex environment, like what they might experience in Afghanistan and things like that. But there were options for them to break up this wargaming for some of the already existing military inland testing grounds, but they chose to do this in this one particular place. And I'm sure it's devastating what's going on out there. I mean, if you read what I wrote in Section 1, anyone that wants to go there, it just kind of sends a chill up your spine in terms of what we have decided to do environmentally with not only these exposures, but other exposures. So.
No, indeed. And the problem was that, yes, we most definitely referenced this and went into considerable detail in part one, but I would say it was a flawed NEPA review because they didn't, the outcomes were not addressed, and public comment was essentially ignored from the places, if I remember correctly. So.
One of the things that they were doing is this is part of what we're going to run up against with the FCC and with other reviews in the future, is that what they were looking for was studies just of marbled murrelets, studies just of owls, studies just of blah, 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 blah. And the information on electromagnetic fields never breaks out like that, almost never breaks out like that. And so to just wave it aside and say no trouble here was a completely incorrect conclusion for that review to have been reached. It's a little on the appalling side, but we're going to run into that again.
Yeah, and that ties in with our most recent paper on ecosystem approaches to addressing this issue. This is, you can't cherry pick with a couple of issues, you know, whether it's marble murrelet or, you know, whatever, spotted owl. You've got to look at impacts of the ecosystem, tree canopy, habitat, all those kind of things. And they completely failed to do that. So
they did. Yeah. So I just had one thing that I wanted to add. You had asked Al about the reception of our paper, but it was sort of targeted to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We were astounded to see how well our papers have been read. As I had mentioned, our 2010 papers had over 75,000 downloads. That's not just hits; that's actual downloads.
Wow.
For the wildlife papers, they've been cited far and wide. The 3-part series, Reviews in Environmental Health, doesn't track the exact readership, but it talks about citations. The Frontiers paper, which was a shorter version of that, published in 2002, is in the 96th percentile range of all papers for all papers that Frontiers has ever published across all subjects. It's way up there in terms of readership. And there's another tracking group that found that of all papers that they've ever tracked across the board, that it is in the 98th percentile. That paper is in the 98th percentile of, they tracked like 24 million papers. It's in the that's the 98th percentile of all papers read. So the subject is hot. It's getting coverage. I have a feeling that it's going to make some serious inroads into people's awareness. The question is what to do next, because it's so complicated to try and mitigate for any of this. Since we love technology, it's all out of the gate already, and humans don't like to be inconvenienced. But there are things that could be done. Subject of another conversation.
Thank you so much for presenting, and to everyone who came on the call to discuss this very important issue.